Greetings, everyone. Joining me on today's Next Gen North podcast is Dr. Tanzil Rahman. Tanzil is a territory boy from Karama, an Oxford scholar, and has spoken publicly at esteemed institutions around the world. In this episode, Tanzil takes us through his love for music and cricket and his motivation for returning to the territory to make a difference as a CLP candidate for Fong Lim. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Dr. Tanzil Rahman, thank you for joining us on the Next Gen North podcast.
Thank you for having me, Stu.
I understand you've just come back from a jaunt overseas to the US. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were doing over there?
In the US?
Yeah.
Oh, the US jaunt was nothing that exciting. I went over to be a groomsman and a MC for one of my best mates' weddings.
Right.
A fella I met in Oxford. It's amazing the people you get to meet there who do all sorts of wild and wacky things. So this fella was from Jersey, and he did a PhD about wine and cheese in France, and somehow that got him to New Zealand.
Lucky for some, eh?
Yeah, exactly. And somehow in Paris he met a nice American young lady, and then they got married in Seattle the other day. So I had a quick run over there to participate in the wedding. But I got downgraded from best man to groomsman number 2, which happens a lot for me because I always seem to be on the other side of the world to where my mates are at any given point in time.
Right.
But it was good, yeah. So it was nice to get away and be in a space surrounded by people really interested in what I was doing at the moment, because the wedding itself was in Seattle, and it was at Bill Gates' local church, which was a bizarre thing.
Wow.
So there's all sorts of interesting characters floating around, a lot of people who are interested in some of the twists and turns of my life at the moment.
Yeah, great. Do you get to do much travel these days, or are you sort of pretty busy, wedded to the spot?
Well, I mean, for somebody who's travelled a lot, I'm actually not a very good traveller. Right. And I'm constantly stressed out and anxious about going anywhere. But travel broadens the mind. It's fantastic to be other places, right? So I returned to Darwin. I got on the plane from England July 31st last year, came back here in August, got straight to work, and then in November did a bit of running around Australia work-wise, and then in December was again for work in Geneva for a bit. But other than that, I haven't really done much travel for a while. So it was nice to duck off to America and back, actually. Yeah,
yeah, great. So you're a Darwin boy, but I understand you weren't actually born here, is that right?
No, so I feel like so I was born in Canberra, so I won't evade the question, as it were, because everybody gets very fussy about the born and bred in Darwin thing. But just to go back a couple of steps, because I think it's always useful for context, I'm a third-generation Territorian.
Right.
My grandfather was a hydrologist, a water engineer, who came over here to work on the Snowy Mountains originally in the late 60s, and on a scholarship. And then he went back to Bangladesh, which is where my family's originally from.
Yep.
And then, except it wasn't Bangladesh back then, it was East Pakistan. And war broke out. They ended up as refugees in India, him, his wife, and their 3 kids, the eldest of whom is my mum. And then back then, the landscape in Australia was very different. Refugees and migrants of that sort would be sponsored to come over here, but they didn't take that deal. They went back to Bangladesh to try and rebuild. But once they went back and realised there was nothing there to really rebuild, a really nice gentleman called Peter Fuchs and his wife Nancy Fuchs, Swiss couple who were based in Darwin, very involved with Rotary for a long time. They sponsored my family to come out here.
Wow.
So everybody came out here initially to Darwin, and they set up camp here. But at a certain point, my dad got plucked to marry my mum, and they got married in Canberra, and I was born there. But what ended up happening was my mum came up here to visit her folks who were still based up here, and was like, I ain't living in Canberra any longer. And so my dad really regrets it, because we built a house that is now so close to Parliament House that it's just ridiculous. But at the time, it was like on the fringes of Canberra. So they came up here for the weather, the lifestyle, the opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's always been it from the very beginning. The Northern Territory's pull was not the blistering hot, but the opportunity. The fact that you could have a relaxed lifestyle, not be a trillionaire, and still actually have a great life here. So born in Canberra, moved up here when I was 2, and then stayed here until I finished high school, and then from that point onwards there was a lot of travelling.
Yeah. So where'd you go to high school?
So I went to Sanderson Primary School, first of all, which no longer exists and is now Menunda Terrace Primary School, and I was in the first class of people to do years 1 to 7 there. Mm-hmm. And then I also was in the first class of people to finish high school from Sanderson High School, which is now Sanderson Middle School.
Yep.
I don't know what it says about it that I went to two schools, neither of which exist anymore. I mean, public schooling was excellent here.
Yep.
And if I'd grown up in the outskirts of Western Sydney, I have really no idea what would have happened to me education-wise. But here,
Yep.
pound for pound, the quality of education I got was just amazing, and teachers were amazing, and it was a great place to grow up, and I just had a wealth of opportunity as a result, and that is what gave me the opportunity to go from going to a local school, working hard, getting a decent shot at going to a decent university, and then having opportunities in life. So. Yeah, Sanderson and Sanderson. But it's weird because whenever I have the old stash or the photos out, people are like, which school is that? Does that even exist? Yeah.
The way you said it, though, makes me think that you think that education standards have changed in the public schools in the Territory. Is that sort of how you're seeing things now?
Oh, I think that's a pretty polite way of putting it.
I'm just trying to be diplomatic.
No, that's fine. Look, I don't want to be unduly harsh about it, but let me put it to you like this. My dad has been a teacher at Darwin High for some 30 years as a maths teacher.
Yep.
And as a result, he still sends me every year the list of the top 20 kids that finish in the school system.
Okay.
I think because once upon a time I was on that list, barely probably. And there used to be a dozen different public schools on that system, on that list.
Yep.
And now there aren't. There's only one. It's Darwin High, and the rest of them are a series of private schools. Now, I'm not anti-private school. That's not what I'm getting at.
Mm-hmm.
But there are structural distortions in our economy and in our society in the Northern Territory that are creating imbalance and socioeconomic dysfunction. The education one is a perfectly good illustration of that. Once upon a time, you could go to the local closest high school and know that you're going to get a decent education for your kid, no matter which one it was, pretty much flatline across the Northern Territory. Now, when your population exceeds a certain point, you get past critical mass. Yes, then you have, private schools, you have diversification, you have other opportunities that come up. It makes sense for there to be specialist schools and the growth in private schools. But it doesn't make sense for it to happen if your population has flatlined, and that's kind of where. So I guess that's the criticism in some ways, because right now, people used to come to the Northern Territory because it was a place where we all basically made more or less the same money.
Mm-hmm.
Like the actual income distribution was very flat,
Right.
because everybody either worked for the government or was servicing government contracts. Public health, housing, education were the norm, the de facto standard. And as a result of that, and we also had a very stable government of one stripe for a very, very long time.
Yep.
And perversely and weirdly, even though that was a notionally conservative government, a CLP government, it was actually like a pseudo-socialist state, because what we had is a stable government, public health, housing, education being consistent,
Yep.
and everybody using the same sort of facilities. One
Yep.
public hospital, one private hospital, but mostly, with the same people going between them, that sort of thing. Education was the best example of that, though, because you would just go to the local school and know that the local school was going to provide you the same opportunity as the other local high school not too far away.
Right.
I'm generalising a little bit, but in broad brush terms,
Yep.
yeah, that's kind of what's gone wrong. And so it's one of many things I think that,
Yep.
lots of structural distortions in our economy. That's a phrase I say a lot,
Yep.
unfortunately.
Well, look, I used to go to Darwin High, and I think, I was public school educated the whole way through, and from my time, people from everywhere, including public schools, were trying to get into Darwin High. So
Exactly.
I seem to remember it as the sort of preeminent
Yep.
institution. I'm not sure if that's the case now, but in terms of fixing, education and the migration problem, we can get to that, and
Yep.
I know you're wanting to get to that, but let's just circle back to your childhood a bit more.
Sure,
What sort of things did you do for fun? How did you spend your a typical sort of Territory childhood?
Well, when I grew up here, there were like 30 Bangladeshi people here, and they're all basically related to me. And my grandfather was the apex of that
Yep.
tribe, and I had uncles and aunts and cousins, and there was a spread of people who were migrant communities from all over, and there was a lot of interaction and, cross-affiliation between all of them.
Sure.
In actual fact, my uncle, my mother's brother, he was married to a Spanish lady, and so I had like a Spanish part of the family, and her older sister were married to Italians, and so there was the Italian family, and her younger sister were married to Greeks, and so there's a Greek family, and so there was a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
There was an awful lot of fat people and a lot of food, right? I think, truth be told, the Bangladeshis were pretty fat in that list compared to the others. But I think typical for us was a lot of spending time in people's backyards, because everybody lived on 1,000 square metre block houses.
And no aircons.
And no aircons, lots of ceiling fans,
Yeah.
and just lots of food and festivity. And there was always a sense of there being a strong sense of community. It wasn't forced, and it wasn't compartmentalised or segregated or isolated.
Yep.
Like a good example in that regard, my grandfather built, along with a couple of other people, the mosque on Vanlin Drive, which was Darwin's first mosque.
Yep.
Now, I grew up in and around that place, just like any sort of church, if you like.
Yep.
And the thing was, it didn't just function as a religious centre, it functioned as a community centre and a cultural centre. And it was a place where people were playing volleyball and playing football and cricket. And it was a place where there was constantly, like, you know, food, markety stuff going on, right? So food was an enormous part of my growing up here, and it is for a lot of people. But I actually think it's one of the things that even now we underestimate the significance of and the value of in terms of it being a binding force and an attracting force in the Northern Territory. So I'd say food was a massive part of it. I'd be like, you know, but then also so was, for me, music and particularly cricket when it came to sport. And so lots of outdoor lifestyle stuff. Again, I think if I had grown up in another place, I probably wouldn't have had access to the musical education that I got here. Whereas here, you know, from primary school onwards, I was getting great quality musical tuition at a public primary school, which is even more remarkable. And that just gave me so many opportunities. So I was involved a lot with a lot of community music things for a long time. I think I have close to the record, actually, myself and maybe a couple of others, on playing in the number of beat festivals. Do you remember those things?
I remember the name,
So they used to be, you know, big musical things involving all the schools that used to happen out in the amphitheatre once upon a time. They're still going now. Now they're in the Darwin Entertainment Centre.
Is it sort of similar to something like the Rock of Stedford?
Yeah, exactly. It's that sort of thing.
Because I remember even that. You know, like
exactly, So I ended up playing in lots of school bands and concert bands and, you know, even things like the symphony orchestra and stuff, opportunities to do that when I was a teenager. So there was a musical life for me, which was quite active. There was also a cricketing life for me, which was very active. I was always a cricketer whose ambitions far exceeded my abilities. Like the gods
join the club.
Well, mate, as I recall, I think you were a territory representative cricketer.
When I was young,
I was a cricketer who was mediocre, and then by the time I finally made it to England and you say, hello, I'm from Australia, I'm a cricketer, it's like, welcome to the first, do you want to captain the side? So that's, you know, but no, here I grew up playing a lot of cricket. All my junior cricket was for pints. And so I really enjoyed all of that. And so what I think I didn't appreciate until I left Darwin and went to the big smoke, as it were, for university, was just how many opportunities I had here, just how diverse the cohort of people I grew up around was, and how privileged that was, you know. Like I can remember when I sort of went to university and someone said, what school did you go to? I didn't really understand what the question meant at the time, you know. I just assumed we were all from different schools from around the country, all living in the same space on a university campus. But it was actually more about...
a loaded question.
It's a completely different question. And with time, of course, you start to understand what that means. But
so did you start answering it differently over
time? Over passage of time I did. And I think by the time I'd finished... So I went to school here, Sanderson Primary, Sanderson High, and then I went to Sydney University. And much to the bitter disappointment of my family, initially chose not to be a medical doctor, because I don't know if you know, but all medical doctors go to heaven. Just ask my dad. And so what I did was initially a music degree at the Sydney Conservatorium. So I basically went to go and play the saxophone, which was not a popular choice with my family at the time. But it was good. I was glad I did it. And I did that, and then an economics degree and a law degree. And so I was at Sydney for a while. And by the time I'd finished, people had a very different understanding of who I was. Because it seemed like, I don't know, you'd befriended a bunch of people from some fancy grammar schools and spent time around a Sandstone University. And when you'd say I'm from Darwin, they'd be like, surely not. But Darwin's produced some amazing people, and most of them leave, and a lot of them used to come back. And that is less and less the case. And I found that even more to be the case once I moved to overseas then, and you'd have those same conversations. But anyway, I started answering the question differently only insofar as I would lead by saying that I was from Darwin, the part at the north of Australia where all the red dirt, the kangaroos and the crocodiles and the Indigenous people actually were. All the stuff that you saw on the advertising. Real Australia, that's where I was from.
Yeah, right. Tell us about your musical tutelage. You sounded quite proud when you were talking about it, a minute ago. Can you explain sort of your musical roots in the Territory?
Yeah, sure. I remember, again, Darwin was just a different place growing up. Dire Straits, the band. I don't know if you remember Dire Straits.
Of course. I remember they actually came here, didn't they?
That's right.
I think it was the year before I was born, but I remember it was bucketing down with rain.
That's exactly it. Yeah, geez, you've got a good memory. So I'm a couple of years older than you, and I remember my mum and uncle and stuff like that, they went to watch Dire Straits play here. And Dire Straits were known for a ton of things, but also they used to have great actual live skilled musicians. And the saxophone player in Dire Straits is a jazz giant, and he wasn't actually on that tour here. But anyway, the saxophone player in Dire Straits was what attracted me to the saxophone. And I can remember being in year 5 and there being a school newsletter from Sanderson Primary School saying, if you'd like to learn a musical instrument, then we can do that. But it costs like $90 a semester or something, and $90 seemed like $1 million to me at the time.
Yep.
And I sort of, I dared not ask, but my mum said to me, would you like to learn an instrument, having seen the thing? And I was like, oh, can we afford it? She's like, yeah, we can afford it. And that's how it started. And, teachers from the Education Department of Music School would come to our primary school, take you out of class, give you one-on-one tuition, the type of which you cannot get in the same way these days that you could back then. There's still musical education that's strong, but it's different than it used to be. And it just provided so many opportunities. So, I was able to get one-on-one tuition, ensemble, experience, and then little by little opportunities opened up to participate, going from the Territory to play with other things nationally and internationally. Mm-hmm. So what some of those things were like attending music camps, if you like, around the country. And so those music camps, I met various instrumental tutors in other places who then encouraged me to go to the Sydney Conservatorium and try and be a jazz musician. So I did go to the Sydney Con, and it was a trial by fire. I was probably too young to go when I went, truth be told, and a bit out of my depth. And so it was tough, but I learned a ton there. But I also figured out pretty quickly I didn't want to make my living just playing the saxophone. Like I wanted to do some other things as well.
Right.
And so it was probably after I left the Conservatorium and then while I was doing my other studies at Sydney Uni that I started to realise that my real skill set was as a leader of musicians in many ways. And so I spent, myself and another gentleman put together the original Sydney University big band, like a 20-piece big band. Yep. And again, we sort of were fumbling our own way and figuring it out as we went. But, and then I did more and more and more of that. And over the years, my main skill set has been running jazz big bands, really. Right. And by the time I'd gotten to the UK, there was the opportunity to really do something with that because, there was more musicians and a brand name that I could leverage from Oxford to be able to try and take musicians around the world. So for a while there, I had a really good lark where I was able to play in international jazz festivals around the world, and it was like a great double life. Yeah. But I should say, one of the things that I used to worry about with Darwin years ago was that, like, if I came back here, I'd be musically frustrated. But I don't think that's the case at all. There's just so much going on here, pound for pound, music-wise, that it's a great place to be involved in the arts. There are squeezes on everyone, funding-wise and opportunity-wise at the moment, but putting that to one side, disproportionately, this place punches above its weight, and it kind of always has, I think. So, so that's sort of the musical journey in a nutshell, if you like. But I'm sort of, I'm a okay saxophone player and a slightly better singer, but I'm basically a good musical director. And so that's where I really started to enjoy what I was doing. And I think in timing, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to make more of a musical contribution up here again. Yeah, right.
So when you say musically frustrated, is that just because you don't have an outlet, or what does that mean exactly to the layman?
What that means is, and this is the part where you're probably going to wrap me around the knuckles for sort of dragging everything back to the same point, but there's an absence of opportunity because there's an absence of input and content, right? There's just not enough musicians. Okay. Just the same way as there are not enough people, not enough capital, not enough ideas, not enough. The Northern Territory is
the same themes kind of emerging.
Well, it's like well, I'm sure we'll end up talking about population and migration and all that stuff in a bit. But just to foreshadow that, I guess, the analogy that I've been using for a while in talking to people around here, and the reason I've come back to the Northern Territory in many ways, is to try and help with population growth and skilled migration and creating more more opportunity for everybody, right?
Yep.
And to do that, you just need more input. So that the analogy I use is that the Northern Territory at the moment is a bit like a swimming pool where the water level is just too low. And it's just not safe to swim in it anymore. And the water quality is starting to go a bit funny.
Right.
And so if you want to raise that water level, you can't just keep trying to turn the old taps up faster because they're maxed out.
Yep.
And at the moment, for example, we all know the federal government is shutting down, for example, the international student tap, right?
Yep.
So then how are you going to fill the pool up faster? You got to find new hoses to fill the pool up with. Now that's a metaphor I used to use in relation to population specifically, but it's actually equally applicable to acquiring financial capital, sustaining businesses, ideas and innovation. It's all the same. The Northern Territory and Darwin at the moment as well needs more of everything.
Right.
And that is financial capital as well as human capital, right? And that also pertains to musicians. So when to your point, absence of opportunity or musically frustrated, the only reason that I've thought that I might become frustrated was because there would be fewer outlets to do things and fewer people to do things with. And there is, as I say, a disproportionately solid number of people involved in the arts here. So that's not entirely, but everybody could use a bit more of everything,
Sure.
right? So if there were a ton more bass players kicking around Darwin, then there'd probably be a ton more jazz combos playing live music in some of the bars and cafes on Friday and Saturday nights, right? If there are a ton more string players and brass players, would probably find the Darwin Symphony Orchestra doing, Mahler 5 programs, enormous kind of things. So that's all, that's what I'm getting at. It's not having a crack at anyone. It's just saying that we used to be growing sustainably in every regard, and we are not anymore. And that's really why I came back, to see if I could help with that problem.
Yeah, okay. So has the advent of social media changed that in a musical sense? Like, you can connect with more people. You're not sort of maybe restricted to your own bubble anymore. How does that change
Yes and
things?
no, because I think we all know that social media, whilst bringing us all closer together in terms of having information, doesn't necessarily bring us closer together in practice.
Sure.
Right? So I played a lot of music through the pandemic over Zoom, and it was about as much fun as it sounds, right? Like, it was initially amusing for everybody, and then ultimately everybody was like, well, I've had enough of this. I'm very much looking forward to making music with another human being in the same space. Same with whatever your activity was. Like, we need human interaction, and you need to be able to do things face to face. So it's a wonderful thing that we're able to connect with people on the other side of the planet and know what they're up to. It's obviously all driving us a bit bonkers as well, constantly being overstimulated and saturated with all of that information. But musically, there's no substitute for hanging out with other people, just the same as there's no substitute for having a cup of coffee with somebody, in person.
Cheers.
Rather than having to do it, over a webcam.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It seems like, even though we're more connected than ever, the people refer to the epidemic of loneliness and all that sort of stuff, which is really sad. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it is really sad. And you see, this is the thing. Once upon a time, we grew up in small villages where we all, we didn't know what was happening in the next village, let alone on the other side of the world. Now everybody knows everything. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But the reason I raise the point is because Darwin was of a good size, as was the Northern Territory, growing sustainably, and that sense of community was being able to be maintained because no one part of that edifice was growing too fast or in an unmanaged way.
Right.
And so as a result of that, we had sort of the right amount, give or take, of everything we needed, whereas now what you see in the Northern Territory is lots of imbalances.
Sure.
Right? And those imbalances are what end up having downstream consequences and creating dysfunction.
Yep.
I want to make this point, actually, because I think it's pertinent to make it at this point. Like, I came back post-pandemic in around, April 2022 or thereabouts, and I was struck by three things in that regard. I basically saw the Northern Territory out of balance in a way that I'd never seen that before. And specifically what I mean by that were three things. At the time, there was basically no viable political opposition. And it doesn't matter what your politics are. It's unhealthy for a place to not have viable political opposition.
Sure.
And so that was allowing one side to get, lazy in its work, frankly speaking. And secondly, the civil service, the public service, which is extremely important here, and which is the backbone of keeping things going around here, was also out of whack. Lots of generals, not enough soldiers, creating inertia and also congestion. And that's a real problem for a place that is basically existing at the behest of taxpayer dollars from down south.
Sure.
Right? So, so that was a secondary problem. And then the third one was the unit cost of living conditions for everyday people. The overlying macroeconomic conditions were so bad now that it was becoming impossibly difficult to live and succeed here, right? You couldn't just move up here now and move into a 1,000 square metre block, 3-bedroom housing commission house, renovate it with time or upscale, send your kid to the local school. Now you had to think about how to break into the housing market separately, how you're going to afford private school fees because it looked like that was the more viable option in some forms for a proper education, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things combined create the recipe, if you like, for socioeconomic fragmentation and disharmony. And I knew a little bit about that because it was the kind of thing that I studied in detail overseas under a professor who used to advise multiple British governments on British white people and all other minorities getting along, not getting along. And a few years ago, it became clear to me, things are starting to break down here socially and economically, because that is what is underpinning all of that. And so it was just really obvious to me, things are going to kick off. Like, things are going to kick off even worse than they already are. And so what we've seen happen recently in Alice Springs, or more recently in Darwin as well, across the whole territory, are signs of that socioeconomic fragmentation. What's above the waterline is what we're seeing. We're seeing public health, housing, education starting to fray and fragment. We're starting to see the ridiculous spikes in crime, the lack of, social cohesion. But the big reason why all of that is happening is the giant iceberg below the waterline. That's exactly right. And so, that's the part that I don't think anybody's been properly tackling, in fairness, on either side of politics for a very long time. And that's the part that I'm trying to do something about. It will take time to deal with the enormous iceberg under the water, but if you start melting away at that, chipping away at that, what's above the waterline will also start to dissipate. Right? And it takes time to do, but I don't want to just harp on and be negative, but you just can't have a 250,000 person population and a $12 billion debt. It doesn't make any sense. There's nothing wrong with borrowing money, but you have to have something to show for it. And over the best part of the last 2 decades, we have very limited amounts to show for what we have done with the money that we have borrowed. So we're going to have to start making some tough choices about how to run the Northern Territory more efficiently, more judiciously. And it's not just about how you spend money, it's also about how you make money, how you stop wasting money, how you save money. And to do those things, you need people in Parliament who can do more than run a sausage sizzle.
I agree. Well, to fix a problem, we have to sort of understand what the problem is. You talk about societal imbalance. So what's the causation? What are the contributing factors to where we, to being where we are now?
So there's a ton of them.
Right.
And right now, you don't have to be an expert of any description to be able to point out a problem, right? Everybody is able to point out what's going wrong in the territory because everyone's being affected in so many ways so significantly. So it's frequently put to me as well, like, well, what are you going to do about it? Other than carp on about it or complain about it, what can we practically do? And this is the part where I'm staking my, I'm putting skin in the game by saying that if there's one single thing that you could do to start turning around the economic and social prospects of the Northern Territory, it would be to concentrate on sustainable population growth.
Right.
Because demographic growth underpins sustainable economic growth. Right? And that is the one thing that we're really falling apart on in the Northern Territory right now. So the contributing factors are many, but let's just focus on the people part of the equation for a second, just so to give that definition. Without the people, you've got nobody to build anything. Without the sustainably growing population, you're not getting in GST revenue in the way that you should. Without the sustainably growing population, you're not having enough inputs and options to be able to diversify the economy, right? And the important thing to understand is it wasn't always like this. If you look at decade by decade, the sort of numbers, what you'll see is in the 1980s, the Northern Territory was growing at 30% population growth elapsed over the decade. And in the 90s and 2000s at 20%. And it was respectable and it was on pace with the rest of the country.
And sustainable?
Because the thing is, as you can see, there was enough places in schools for kids to go to. There were enough teachers to teach those people. There wasn't a critical shortfall of healthcare workers to keep the hospital system going, and so on and so forth, right? So yes, sustainable. We didn't have pressure on the system in various points like we do now. And what's happened is that we have raced ahead in some ways and fallen behind in other places, and that's created all these imbalances now, so that now everybody's stressed about how to enter the rental market, let alone buy a house in the absence of there being supply and at a time of extremely high cost of living pressures and super high interest rates and so on and so forth, right? Like, we can't control interest rates or inflation in the Northern Territory, but we can control lots of the other pieces of the puzzle there. So on the demographic question specifically, in the last decade, right, probably from about 2012 onwards, is when we see our population growth plummet to under 5% elapsed over the decade.
Right. Now,
why did that happen, right? This is getting to the core of your, like, what are the reasons for this? In that specific space, probably 3 versions of the same thing happen at the same time, and they end up hollowing out the productive capacity of the local economy. So in the mining and gas sector, we start relying more on FIFO to the point where it's unhealthy. And if you have enough substitute capacity coming in, you stop doing things locally, right? And all of what is generated here gets taken out, whatever that might be. Same problem, for example, in healthcare, right? If you start relying on agency workforce to stopgap things, but then you over-rely on it and you become dependent on it, it starts becoming a crutch, and it's essentially bankrupting our healthcare system at the moment. But the worst version of all 3 of those, in my opinion, is that we've shifted over a period of time from focusing on permanent migration to focusing on temporary migration mechanisms, which we've been using for the best part of 20 years. And so the generation that came through, you know, my grandparents' generation and some time after that, were brought to Australia with the promise of a fair go and the opportunity to put down roots and to build something and make a contribution. But now what we've done is eroded that by making things very uncertain. And so for quite a while now, we've been attracting people to the Northern Territory using the migration mechanisms that are available to us by the Commonwealth, right? And those mechanisms are attracting people to come to the Northern Territory who are figuring out how to leave before they've even arrived, whether it's international students or temporary skilled migrants. And so what ends up happening is, if you bring people over here to do things where they're essentially set up to fail, to try and integrate into a local economy, or to study something that doesn't have a pathway to proper employment up here, why are we then surprised when they graduate on to doing low-skilled work, driving cabs, working in Woolies, getting frustrated and ultimately going, do you know what? Now that I've got my permanent residency, bugger it. I'm moving down to Sydney or Melbourne or the fringes of, where at least I know more people and I might have a better chance of creating a better life for myself and my family. And the problem with that is that then puts masses of pressure on infrastructure, public health, housing, education elsewhere. So, you know, all of those 3 things at the same time mean that we stop getting as many people who are coming here with the intention to come and stay and build. And so it's one thing to attract big industry here, but if you don't have the arrangements with them to use local workforce and or cultivate local workforce solutions, but instead you give them a free pass and say, we just need you to do business here at all costs. And so
you sell the farm to do so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, you know, we need sustainable industrial growth. We need mining and resource development, but we also need it to be built on the model where both the OPEX and CAPEX are equally valuable. And we don't just let people, I think the new nomenclature for it from the Federal Treasury is rip and ship, right? You can't say, I mean, if you just allow people to come and take our resources away for free without there being any buy-in for us locally, well, then you get what you get. It's being in a very bad, unequal relationship. So, I mean, I've digressed a little bit, but what I'm basically getting at is that we just don't have sustainable population growth, sustainable demographic growth to underpin sustainable economic growth. We spent a ton of time lately chasing big white whale projects, saying to the people, if we can land a big white whale,
it'll fix our woes.
It'll feed all the people until the end of time. But here's the thing. If you don't have a strategy for how to salt and preserve the meat, all you're left with is the guts and the bones. And that's what's happened to us a few times over. And we do have tons of opportunity here in terms of resource extraction and large-scale things that could, you know, create more, could grow the size of the economy. But it'll be temporary. It'll be like collecting a ton of straw and setting it on fire if we're not careful. What we really need is to put in the hard work to collect logs, which take more effort to procure and then to light and sustain so that we have sustainable economic growth. Sorry, I'm mixing metaphors quite a lot.
That's okay.
But you probably, I mean, I'm sure you get the gist of where I'm coming at with it. Some of the small, less sexy stuff is what the Northern Territory is built on. Agriculture, tourism and hospitality, local business and small business, investment in public services basically, right? And those small engines of growth created the platform for us then to do the next thing, right? And we've kind of dropped the ball, in my opinion, on a ton of those things.
So it was more like step change,
That's
as
right.
opposed to these sort of gaping
That's right.
leaps and then peaks and troughs sort of thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And everybody can identify those peaks and troughs, right? Everybody can identify that we've had boom and bust economic cycles.
Yep.
And these are some of the underlying reasons for why it's happening. But a very significant change is that now, demographically, we're in decline. In real terms, even though, I mean, it's pathetic that we spend, the tens of millions of dollars that we do to try and attract and retain people to the Northern Territory and get less than 1% population growth for our efforts. Like we need to be tracking a 2.5% population growth. And there's just no way any of that can happen unless you start to fundamentally rethink how we do business in the Northern Territory.
Yeah.
So, I would suggest that if you're going to focus on one single thing to start stimulating economic growth here again, it would be to focus on the people side of the equation.
Okay.
And that's kind of partly why at the moment you'll see that, as you're aware, I'm running as a political candidate, and the people I'm working with are interested in doing the one thing that all economists agree is good in relation to solving the housing crisis, which is increasing supply. We're incentivizing people to build new homes here, right?
Right.
To increase supply.
Yep.
And, there are more plans in that direction that I think will come with time.
Yep.
Likewise, the calculated gamble has been made to invest in small businesses, allowing to invest in themselves by making a cut in payroll tax.
Right.
A lot of people will look at that initially and be like, oh, isn't that giving away own source revenue? Yes, it is. But it's also taking a calculated gamble to try and create growth in an area we know will work. Because if you look at the data, right, one of the things I'd point out is that there are only 3 sustained periods where we've had economic growth that correlates with positive net interstate migration and demographic growth throughout 50 years of the Northern Territory. Okay. It's the early 80s, the mid 90s, and just briefly in the 2000s. It's when we create housing. It's when we create public infrastructure. It's the post-Cyclone Tracy rebuild in the early 80s when we build new suburbs like Karama and Palmerston and what used to be the Northern Territory University. In the mid-90s, it's like Cullen Bay. See, the thing is, if you build a Cullen Bay, it means that people in other affluent suburbs move into the new Cullen Bay, creating some headroom in the market, right? Yeah. So you've got to create supply, basically. So those are the kind of things that we're trying to...
And people have got a bit upward and downward mobility in that sense, people moving out of the areas and then people moving in. Sort of thing. Yeah.
And if you just don't have enough supply, then there's gridlock in the system.
Wow.
But there are right now, as you're aware, there's a ton of blockages everywhere, right? So you could pick any number of things to focus on. And there is, for example, now a lot of focus on social dysfunction and crime in the Northern Territory. Sure. And that's very reasonable because crime is out of control and it just hasn't been managed properly for a while. There have been very few consequences in a lot of that space. And what needs to be done is for the patient that is hemorrhaging and bleeding out to be stabilised. And so again, I think we have concrete plans for how to stabilise the patient were it to be the case that, there's a change of government. The question then is, what do you do once you stabilise the patient? And that's the part that, I'm trying to make a little bit of a contribution towards.
Yeah. So I did see a figure where minus 67, I think, net negative migration for the December quarter. I'm not sure if you saw that figure.
Sure.
Can you just explain, in a small jurisdiction like the Territory, what are the implications of something like that?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing to say is that you can make statistics tell you whatever they want, and you can, statistics and damn lies. Yeah. And if you pick a single data point like that, you can get a completely distorted picture. Sure. And what's been happening for a while is that, with no disrespect to the public service or our political overlords, people have been cherry picking data to tell whatever story they want to tell. And so it's easier to say, in this quarter, everybody left and the whole place is collapsing. Or another one to say, business is booming, everything is up massively for this one quarter. Yeah. What you really need to do in that sense is zoom out. And that's why I look at the aggregated data elapsed over a longer period of time. Yep. And I will look at it not just in a quarterly sense or a yearly sense, but in decades and in different chunks like that. When you do that, you get a more accurate sense of what's going on. To your question of what it means when people are going, well, the first thing to realise is in relation to population, the people coming and going, we all know, those of us that have grown up here, that Darwin is a transient population. We all know that people come and go, but we also know those stories about people came for 3 months and then stayed for 30 years,
Yep.
you know, all that sort of stuff. There's data bias there because the people who did that are the only people who are still here we're talking to. We don't know about all the ones that left.
Yep.
But if you zoom out and look at the data across the time, what you can see are consistent patterns. The first one you'll see is that, so population growth is made up of 3 different things. It's made up of natural increase, which is births minus deaths. Mm-hmm. It's made up of interstate migration, who comes and goes from, you know, interstate, and overseas, net overseas migration, the same thing, who comes and goes from overseas. Now, our natural increase was always reasonably flat, but growing slowly.
Yep.
And it was particularly because we had a younger population who had kids on a reasonably fertile population, as it were. And some of that is starting to slow down as across different bands, women are having kids older and fewer of them, mm-hmm. right? And that's particularly the case in our data in the Northern Territory for Indigenous women.
Right.
So our natural increase is now starting to stagnate and actually decline a little bit. But that was one of the areas where we were growing sustainably over a long period of time. But that's not really the big part of it. Interstate migration, which is really what everybody's freaking out about at the moment. Here's the thing, our resting state is to have negative interstate migration. We've always attracted this many people and then lost a ton more of them to other places, right?
Yep.
That's always happened. But it wasn't always as bad as it is now. Now we're starting to lose those people. Now I'll come back to interstate migration in just a tick.
Yep.
Because the real big one is overseas migration.
Okay.
The Australian productivity story and growth story is one and the same as its immigration policy story. Basically, Australia grows off the back of overseas migration, right? And every other state and territory grows on the back of it as well.
Yep.
And we haven't been doing that in the way that we should be for a while for the reasons I explained earlier. So if you really want to stimulate population growth, what you need is to attract people from overseas. But the key thing is to be attracting the right people, not people who are coming and using this as a stepping stone to elsewhere.
Sure.
Right? Now let's just come back to interstate migration for a second. A CDU did an interesting bit of work not too long ago with a very sexy title, Macroeconomic Correlates for Net Interstate Migration. The upshot of that work is that nothing that we've really done for 20 odd years has made much difference policy-wise in people coming here and staying here.
Yep.
The one thing that tracks the best statistically in their work for having an influence is when housing conditions are basically terrible down south
Right.
and attractive up here.
Yep.
So if we can provide attractive at the same time as it's crappy down there,
Yep.
people will come and then the question is how to make them stay. So that's what we're trying to incentivize at the moment, because we know right now there's a housing crisis.
Yep.
We know there's a supply crisis. Even though people are very upset about how hard it is to rent here, there's more than 2% headroom in the rental market here. There's less than 1% headroom in the rental market down south. Mm-hmm. And you need about 3% to have like a buoyant market with options.
Right.
So what we're trying to do at the moment is people who are disaffected in New South Wales and Victoria, say to them there's a more attractive option up north if you want to come up here to come and settle and live and grow, right?
Yeah.
But to come all the way back to your question, what does it mean when you lose those people, when there's that loss of people? Well, it depends on how many people you're losing and how big your place is. If our place was bigger and we were losing a few, we'd still be okay. But when the water level is this low in the pool already, losing a small amount of water has a massive effect.
Yep.
Equally, a small increase in the amount of water is useful, even a small one. But what we need is regular small increases in that regard, right? So the Commonwealth government for a long time has done what it can, if you like, on migration for the Northern Territory, because when we go with our hand in hat saying, please, can we have more people? They say no, because you don't know how to keep them there and look after them properly anymore, right? That's essentially what is being said in very, very long reports in much more sophisticated ways.
Yeah.
But there is an appetite right now for there to be change, because the north of Australia, which is not just the Northern Territory, but also Northwest Australia and North Queensland, all face similar problems in relation to providing resilience for the country. The fact is, I used to jokingly say to people in England a lot, the Northern Territory exists so that Asia didn't invade 1 million years ago, right? And there's some truth in that, in the sense that something must exist up here for defence purposes, for strategic... Yeah, exactly. And right now we live in difficult geopolitical times.
Yep.
There are defence considerations, there are national security considerations. It's extremely important that we have a strong, robust north of Australia, which is, as I say, not just the Northern Territory, but also North Queensland and Northwest Australia, and that we have a strategy for how to grow the north of Australia and to develop the north of Australia. And that agenda's fallen off the radar for a little while. It's been a while since there was a white paper on North Australia, and there are in the background movements to do a refresh of all of that work.
Yep. And
a lot of that will be discussed at, there's a little plug for myself, I guess now, the Developing North Australia Conference is happening in the last week of August. I was lucky enough to get a Guernsey to speak at it as well, and there'll be a series of people there talking about how to create resilience in the north of Australia again.
Yep.
Funnily enough, I have to hop on a plane the day after the election to go and speak at that. So it's either going to be, here's a blueprint for the future, or it's all gone horribly wrong for me. Here's a blueprint for the future.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen. But either way, I think it's important that we're having these discussions.
Yep.
Because, the whole of the north of Australia faces similar challenges. They're just a lot worse in the Northern Territory
Yep.
Than they are in some of those other places which have a bit more electoral clout as well.
Excuse me. Well, it seems like I'm noticing a strong theme emerging, and it's centering on housing. I mean, I know to an extent the Australian economy is built on houses and holes, so to speak.
Yeah.
Why haven't we built? Then the question becomes to me is, why haven't we built more houses in the Northern Territory? And then another question is, are we too housing centric, and has our federal housing policy failed us in that regard, with negative gearing, the capital gains, I think tax benefit?
Yeah.
Can you just tell us your thoughts on that?
I can tell you a few things. First of all, I shouldn't second guess the policy decisions that have been made by government departments or by former ministers in our jurisdiction or federally. But there's widespread recognition now that the reason we've got a housing crisis is an absence of supply.
That's right.
Yeah. And so at various points, we have incentivised people being able to create opportunities to invest in housing rather than to own or occupy. Mm-hmm. And so there are active conversations about all of that and what to do about all of that. But right now, the focus is on creating supply.
Right.
Now, here's the thing. Even if the federal government says to the Northern Territory government, here's the money to build 11,000 new houses, who's going to build them, mate? Are you going to build them?
Yeah.
Right? There used to be jokes about Greek builders in this town. They're not even in the top 10 ethnicities of Territorians anymore because so many of them have found it so difficult to do business here that they've moved on, right?
Yep.
So again, it comes back to people to build the stuff, right? So why have we stopped focusing on it? It's not necessarily that with a lot of things, I think it's important to understand it's not necessarily because of malicious decisions that we've ended up where we are. Some of it is ineptitude. Some of it is negligence. Sometimes it's a little bit of just bad luck. But what's happened is that as we've started to prioritise building McMansions on small blocks, we've stopped doing what used to be called, for us anyway, up here, housing commission kind of housing, right? Like reasonable housing where families could live and be there for a while and then add value to that or trade up, right, in the system. And if you stop creating that and you just create polarised options for housing where it's either mega mansion in lovely new suburb or alternatively busted council flat, then that's where you start creating problems, right? Because there's nothing in between to sort of, step change along the way. Now, completely re-engineering the Australian economy is outside of my remit or any of our remit, right?
Yep.
So negative gearing isn't going away anytime soon and so on and so forth. But what we can do in our own polity is place better bets on how to grow our economy. So what's happening at the moment, and I know this is a little bit overstated and a bit glib putting it this way, is that the government of the day in the Northern Territory, which is massively and unreasonably and irresponsibly in debt, is basically going double or nothing. Like that's the strategy. It's like we're placing massive bets on catching big white whales, and if we catch them, we'll all be fine.
Yep.
But we haven't landed one for a very long time, and last time we did it didn't work out very well at the end of it either. That's not to say that it couldn't be different, but I would suggest rather than focusing on catching big white whales, we should be focusing on catching smaller fish.
I agree.
Which we could use to feed the people faster, and then, we've got more people who are better fed to go chase white whales later on as well. Yeah. Okay? And so it's not that housing is the singular focus, it's just that in our data set, what we can see clearly is that when we build the surplus capacity for housing, actually the people come to live in it, and then the jobs and opportunities are created from there, not the other way around. The thinking is often that if we land a big industry, the jobs will come with it. And that's the narrative that keeps being peddled. But it's just not borne out in the data. It's just not true. You can't just keep saying if we land this massive project, this major project, one of the many, 75 of them or something that are on the Northern Territory government's books, that it will save us all, right? The smaller stuff along the way has been neglected. And there's nothing wrong with diversifying our economy, but overstretching it and going into realms that aren't productive and are speculative isn't super helpful. And I don't want to take pot shots at things that have failed because it's sort of a little bit cheap. But the truth is, I don't know whether we should have been investing in bottled water or prawn farms or launching spaceships. Like the space one is a good example. How are you going to compete with countries like Saudi Arabia underpinning a space launch operation, right, with infinitely deep pockets? Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have a dabble in that, but the federal government at the moment is making calculated risks on what is essentially interventionist and protectionist thinking, following suit with what's happening in the rest of the wider world, saying that we want to subsidise a series of industries to try and create a blueprint for growth in the future. But their own productivity commissioner, who they appointed, questions that kind of strategy, saying, look, it's a nice idea, but maybe we shouldn't be making solar panels. Maybe we should just be buying them from people who make them better, right? Now, as I say, I don't want to poo-poo any particular sector. The federal government's strategy is a separate strategy, but I think it's important for Territorians to understand that the federal government is currently splashing cash in the direction of the Northern Territory, not because it thinks the Northern Territory is being run amazingly well, but because this is where those critical minerals are. This is the backbone of where they need to get their renewable strategy up and running. And, there's so much confusion about our energy market and, what our energy future should be. I think it's important to have a balanced view about it and understand that we've got an insane amount of sun to do something sensible with solar, but we've also got a huge amount of gas to do something very sensible with as well. And, questions about nuclear energy are it's fine to have the questions and the debate and the discussion, but ultimately it's 15 years and $15 billion away. And no matter what people want to tell you about nuclear modular reactors, none of that is happening anytime super soon. Right? So right now in the Northern Territory, which we care about, where we live, where we have cost of living pressures, we need to create energy resilience. We have to think about how to economically and environmentally sustainably get gas into the equation and keep some of that gas for us. And likewise, how to make our solar system work. Because just putting panels on roofs isn't going to solve the problem. You have to deal with the back-end infrastructure and you have to connect that operation.
Grid stability and all that sort of stuff.
Exactly. And it's not my area of subject matter expertise, so I don't want to go, bananas on it. But like I say, it's not just about incentivizing people to capture sun. But the one thing we can all agree on, and certainly after a bunch of years in England I can agree on, is we've got a lot of sun, mate. Like it's I'm roasting in it every day whilst door knocking 6 hours a day. So
So just on housing, one more thing quickly. So is something like a stamp duty concession something that we could reassess, say the CLP were to get in government? We can control the controllables, so to speak. You can't control interest rates and things like that. But, if there's a mum and dad, they've got their 4-bedroom home and they go, well, if we get out of this, and buy a new place in the Territory, we're going to be up for a substantial stack of tax on stamp duty. Is that something that we could consider as a jurisdiction to just give people that upward, downward mobility, free up some housing stock, and progress that way? That might just be a small thing, small change on your laundry list of policy things.
So the first thing is absolutely it's a thing that be considered. The second thing is it ain't a small thing,
right?
And again, I encourage us to just pause and put it to one side and think about the bigger picture. Okay. If we are to be responsible fiscal managers of the economy, you need to have a strategy not just for how to spend money, but how to, as I say, stop wasting it, save it, and make it. Now, all 4 of those things are separate things. Now, the Northern Territory does not have a large amount of own source revenue. And so what we do have, we have to be smart about how we use. And likewise, like a lot of people here will consider that there's a lot of welfare economics that goes on up here. People sometimes forget the entire of the Northern Territory exists at the behest of Victorian and New South Wales taxpayer dollars, right? We're up here to provide the Northern Territory for the whole of Australia, but we have to make good use of what we're given by the federal government. So stamp duty is yet another thing, like payroll tax or, like concessions, incentives rather, for people to create new housing stock that you could use, But you can't give it all away in one go And you certainly shouldn't give it away without having a clear idea of where you are in the economic cycle.
Sure.
Now, at the moment, the Queensland government, for example, has just offered, the Queensland state Labor government I'm talking about, is offering enormous cost of living concessions in the lead up to their next election.
Yep.
And actually, the opposition has said, we'll support them if they go through. They can afford to do that. I'm not talking about the political calculus. They can afford to do that because they have a budget in surplus, right? And although that will drive them into a small deficit, that's a healthier budget. We have a $12 billion economy with 250,000 people.
Yep.
I certainly won't advocate for us giving away any more money unnecessarily without thinking it really through, right?
Sure.
And you've got to take a look at the whole bigger picture, because I don't want to be alarmist, and I'm not the kind of person who trades in hyperbole. But if you think things are bad here now in relation to being able to live here, work here, invest here, if we default on our debt ceiling, which is not implausible given we're at $12 billion and that all of our future predictions for own source revenue are, in my opinion, very, very optimistic, right? Like there are mines that are set to close in the foreseeable future, no certainty as to when new ones will open, uncertainty about commodity prices going into the future as well. If you suddenly become a jurisdiction that essentially bankrupts itself and defaults, good luck raising any money or doing business in this polity then. And that's when we'd have to make hard decisions about,
austerity.
Exactly, right? So, I mean, you said it. Like, austerity measures are not brought in lightly, and they're brought in when things are dire. Now, we're not quite there yet. And if responsible people are put in charge of the economy, I think it can be turned around. But I think people seriously underestimate just how grave the consequences will be of if we blow much more money willy-nilly. Right? Like, I mean, I hate to break it to you, but, the Chief Minister wrote an op-ed the other day saying territory poised for economic growth. I would counter that and say what we need is a plan for sustainable economic growth, not fiscal fantasies. That's my honest feeling. It's not a opinion that you hear out loud much, but I think that's partly also because the state of democracy in the Northern Territory is not super healthy at the moment. Like, people are finding it very difficult to voice dissent without fear of consequences. And so if my contribution is nothing more than to raise awareness about some of the issues, so be it. I mean, I do think in that regard, like, obviously I'm biased. I'm a migration population guy. That's my subject matter expertise. But, now it's on the agenda. And I will say, to the credit of the CLP, they have been interested in new ideas, new people, new thinking. And that's why I'm working with them, because right now a core part of our platform is growing the population sustainably. Is about bringing skilled workforce back to the territory. And the Labor government is entirely silent on those issues because they know that it's essentially falling apart under their watch.
So you mentioned the debt before, and you mentioned an analogy of stabilising the patient. Is in your mind step one, day one, election win, getting control of the debt? Is that sort of how you're going to proceed? Is that sort of...
No, I think it's actually, it's more, there are more emergency interventions. Now I'm going to make bad medical analogies instead, metaphors instead. But I think, the CLP leadership has made it clear that in week one of us coming into power, were that to be the case, we would immediately think about what we need to do in the crime and correctional services spaces to be able to stabilise the polity. That's really what needs to be done, because the patient is bleeding out. There are businesses that are closing, there are people that are leaving because of the absence of economic opportunity. We've known that for a while, but now it is true that the crime situation is also adding weight to that and accelerating that process. So I think the first order of business is to stabilise the patients by dealing with crime, correctional services, social dysfunction, to give people the sense that grown-ups are running the place again, right? And then the next order of business, I would argue, albeit, let's be clear, I'm a soldier, not a general, so I'm not in a position to be able to dictate anything. But I would try and bring the economic argument to the front, to the fore. Because I will say that certainly in the CLP realm, there's no resistance to that. Like, we want to be good fiscal managers. All of our leadership, whether it's management, parliamentary wings, individual branches, there is consensus that the economy must be brought under control. And so I think it'll be a focus, I'd say that.
I read in an article in, I think it was 2008 on you, that you always had political ambitions. I guess the question becomes, you said that the Territory was always going to be the place where that platform begins. So I just have to ask now, why the Territory and why now?
Okay, well, I'll give you, it's a really good question actually, and it's a fair one. When I was younger, on the basis of having a big mouth and a not insignificantly sized ego, I probably had delusions of grandeur of being involved in something like politics because it looked glamorous.
Yep.
Now, along the way, I was involved a lot with student politics, and I'm a centrist and a moderate, but I've worked for a sort of Labor, Liberal, Conservative here and in the UK in various forms for years. But I've never been a member of a political party because I always kind of knew.
Sorry, is that in an advisory capacity? Or
Yeah, in lots of different ways. Like sometimes it's been like providing research for, sometimes it was being a political staffer, sometimes it was being like in sort of different ways. Okay. And like, for example, I wrote a thesis on welfare reform and North Australia back in, the mid-2000s as part of my economics degree. That caught the attention of the then Senator Trish Crossan, who liked it and then gave me a call, wanted to meet with me, and then said, hey, how would you like to work in Parliament for a while? So then I went to work for her for a while. It was a great learning experience, right? So things like that have come up along the way for me in different places. But I also learned by the end of student politics, I was like, I ain't ever doing this again. This is terrible. These people are all psychos. This is a terrible way to live a life. I don't have it in me maybe, or the thick enough skin to be able to work in party politics. And back then, all my politicking was as an independent, right? And if you're an independent, you just get hammered from both sides. And that's what I really learned in that process. And I didn't particularly know whether I could be a party person. And so the answer to your question, I am answering your question. I just want you to understand it fully. A few years ago now, so when I finished in Sydney, I moved to the UK. My PhD was about maintaining competitiveness in the global market for skilled migrants. It took ages to finish my DPhil, but once I had, then I was starting to make way academically and starting to advise governments, multinational institutions, private sector stakeholders around the world on how to grow your population and workforce. That was my wheelhouse. I planned to come back here and sort of set up camp here in 2019 or so, but then the pandemic got in the way and I couldn't. So then I got stuck a bit longer. I had a contract to write a book, and so I was sort of writing a book in the background. And what ended up happening was that I reached out around that time to the Gunner government to say to them, I think you have a population and workforce problem. I'm a kid from Karama. I think I can help. I'm not, now I'm also, a sort of pseudo-academic researcher person. And unfortunately, they weren't interested in what I had to offer. So then I tried a year later again when there was a change of chief minister, and I got the same response. And it was disappointing. And then what I ended up doing was catching the attention of Dr. Frank Daly, the chief executive of the Department of Chief Ministers and Cabinet, by putting the same argument to him, I think in March of 2023. I think that's about right. And he was the first person that was willing to give me a run. And so Frank recruited me back here to lead and focus the Northern Territory government strategy on migration, talent acquisition, and population policy. And that was worth giving up my foothold in Oxford for, to come back and try and make a difference. And so I came back here, but unfortunately the place is so politically dysfunctional that he got fired a few months after me starting. And as soon as he did, my whole agenda also was falling apart. I was, an executive director in government with no staff, with no administrative assistance, operating as a single person trying desperately to get an agenda up. And I was making some progress, ironically with the federal Labor government, but not with the Territory Labor government, who just didn't want to shine lights on problems. But in December, for example, I went as part of the Federal Immigration Minister's delegation to the Global Refugee Forum in Geneva, which is the largest immigration forum in the world, basically, to try and broker new workforce pipelines for the Northern Territory, specifically in healthcare at the time. And so we were making progress on the agenda, if you like. But when I came back from that, successfully having done some work modelled on what the National Healthcare Service is doing in the United Kingdom to attract nursing workforce from around the world, from places other than just India and the Philippines, where people have been doing it for ages and they're running out of people to give us. I basically got told in no uncertain terms that I was being gotten rid of one way or the other because it's just not popular to shine lights on problems right now, which I think is really unfortunate and unhealthy. And I'm not specifically so politically leaning in either direction that I take any great delight in the current predicament of the Northern Territory. I think it's sad that Labor has squandered the opportunity to demonstrate good leadership in the north of Australia for the best part of 20 years. But that's why I basically hadn't joined a political party for 25 years, and in November last year joined the Territory Labor Party hoping to try and help and signal that I wanted to help out. Didn't make any difference. There was nowhere to contribute, no conference, nobody wanted to hear what I had to say. Less than 2 months, or less than 3, I guess, months later on Australia Day, I just resigned because I was like, well, this is a waste of time. And then I just threw my hat in the ring with the CLP.
You got more traction with your migration and population?
100%. 100%. What happened was that last October, I went to a business lunch, and it wasn't a great event. It sort of dragged on forever and everyone was having a miserable time. And late in the event, Shane Stone, the former Chief Minister, wandered in and sort of somehow magicked the microphone in his direction and gave a great speech. And everyone was like, wow, we forgot that there were articulate people who could lead us. And at the end of it, I went up to him and I said, Mr. Stone, you don't know me, but you knew my grandfather, I think, because you helped organise his Order of Australia for services to multiculturalism. And he said, are you Mr. Huck's grandson? And then we just got talking. And at the end of it, he was like, if you're ever interested in politics, we need people like you to put their hand up. And I said, thanks for the opportunity, but I'm going to stay in the public service and try and problem solve from within the public service.
Sure.
Because back then, Frank was still there. And but he wasn't for much longer. And then I didn't call him. I didn't get in touch with the CLP. I thought really carefully about it. Truth is, I came really close to running as an independent.
Right.
And the reason I didn't was because I want to actually be able to help the government of the day structurally reform the economy rather than just throw stones at the building from the outside for 4 years, with no disrespect to independence. I think it's important that there are options that people have to choose, because as I said way back when, we haven't had viable political alternative and options up here for a while. It's good to see that there are people that are interested in standing of all different stripes. But for me, the choice was very clear. The only people with the capacity to lead and direct and salvage and rebuild the Northern Territory, in my opinion, are the CLP. And so, I have a huge amount of regard for Leah Finocchiaro on the simple basis that for someone to endure and survive what she has over 12 years now, she's somebody I'm willing to hitch my star to. I want to support her to be the best Chief Minister she can be. But Leah's not superhuman. She needs good people surrounding her as well. And so that was the choice that I made. I was like, okay, there's not a lot of economic muscle at the moment floating around, and I'd like to be able to help. And I tried to work with the government of the day and got nowhere. And then what I found was a much more receptive audience in the CLP. I found people that were genuinely interested in, improving the lot for Territorians. Like, I've got family still in Bangladesh on my dad's side, and they've been bemused by the fact that I'm now a political candidate. And they're asking my dad, like, what is the CLP? What is its motto? What is its creed? And my dad was like, it's the Territory Party. And he was like, oh, what does that mean? And that's just it. Like, I think it's important that people understand what that is again. And the Territory Party is the party that was representative of the Territory polity, didn't get in your way, allowed you to have opportunity, basically was the party of laid back opportunity and prosperity, right? And now we've got all sorts of red tape in the way. We've got, way too many generals and not enough soldiers. We've got bloated edifice. We've got all sorts of distortions. And so some of that just needs to be cleaned up, right, in a significant way. I sometimes say this jokingly on the doorsteps when I'm out and about, when people are asking me about what we're about and what I'm about and all that sort of thing. And one of the things that tracks the best, I don't know if I just think it tracks the best, but my feeling is that Territorians, right, are actually not particularly ideologically predisposed in either extreme direction very much. I think
pretty apathetic.
Well, potentially, but I'd like to think of it less as apathy and more as just sort of ideologically laid back.
Okay.
Right? I think most people are interested in being able to afford a Luxor, pay their, rent, or if they're lucky, their mortgage, and not get stabbed. Like, I'm being serious.
Simple things, eh?
Yeah, basically. And right now, those fundamentals are getting really tougher.
Yeah.
And that's a serious thing. Like, if you don't allow people to succeed, then you set them up to fail. Don't be frustrated by people misbehaving if you're not giving them opportunities and ways and means to advance their prospects in life, right? So, you know, I think about 2 hours ago you asked me, why now politics? Because the building's on fire, because I've got a bucket and hose, and I was on the other side of the planet and I realised it's now or never. I've been, you know, poncing around Oxford, having a lovely life. It's talking all about how I'm from the north of Australia, but I'm either from the north of Australia or I used to be from the north of Australia. And so I came back now, and I think it's a time-sensitive matter. I didn't actually have any intention of getting involved in this election, like none. I wanted to do what I was doing within the public service, and then with the passage of time, maybe in the future, maybe be involved. But my personal feeling is that things are so dire now that without sensible people taking over leadership soon, we're all going to be in much, much worse trouble. So it wasn't clear to me. I only got involved in this in February. Like, that's it. I got in touch in February with the CLP and I said, I'm interested. And they said, well, you know, so is everyone now.
The pylon.
Yeah, that's it. And, you know, I had to beat out 20 other very good people. I think probably, I don't know who they were, but I know there was a lot of people that applied to be pre-selected in Phong Lim. And yeah, I'm delighted that they showed faith in me to be the candidate. And it's I haven't faced a lot of the resistance that people feared for me, I think. Like, politics is different everywhere, but a lot of people overseas that I knew were like, are you going to be comfortable in the right of centre Conservative Party, given that you're pretty centrist? And I did worry about that. I was like, is it going to be a series of nut jobs? Well, here's a tip, Stu. I mean, there are nut jobs and psychos on all sides of politics. They just are.
And
right?
there's a spectrum in your parliamentary wing, right? Like,
absolutely. And what I will say is that I don't see that in the CLP. The modern CLP, with the current parliamentary wing, the current leadership led by Shane Stone, the people in the branches, I see a bunch of people who are pretty centrist and pretty, you know, some of them would prefer smaller government, and some of them would prefer that we were less of a welfare state, and I think those are all perfectly valid arguments. But when I went to my first central council, where they were sort of codifying all the pre-selections, I was really impressed by the quality of the debate and the engagement. There were people who were able to put their hands up and propose, I would like things to be this way, and somebody else saying, I don't think that's reasonable, and someone else saying, this is what we should do instead. And there was a sensible vote and a policy position and platform that came through the middle. And that's what I wanted to be part of as well. And I went to a pre-selection with 15 other people grilling me for 3 hours on everything from A to Z, and all I wanted was the opportunity to be heard. And I was heard and given a fair go. And I think that's why I'm very comfortable being a CLP candidate, and all the more so because I think the incoming batch of candidates across the territory for the CLP, there's some really, really quality people there. There's some hardworking people with some real life experience who are doing it for the right reasons. You know, and I really hope that enough of us get up to form a majority government and then be able to support Leah to be a chief minister for a very long time.
So you are the CLP candidate for Phong Lim. You know, you've been pounding the pavement recently. What's the main feedback you've been getting? You know, what are the issues on the ground for that constituency?
Well, I hate to say it because it just seems so cliched, but the number one thing is crime and social dysfunction.
Right.
Everywhere you go. Like, I mean, my beat is Stuart Park, Bayview Haven, the Narrows, Woolner, everything back to Berrima. Right? It's a big patch, covers Charles Darwin National Park, Wishart, East Arm, all of that.
Yeah, industrial, residential, sort of a bit of a mixed bag.
You got all sorts, right? But everywhere you go, there are versions of crime. There's versions of crime with warehouses in Winnellie being broken into, and there's versions of crime in Bayview with houses being, you know, and look, so the crime and social dysfunction stuff is serious, and people want it dealt with, and we are committed to dealing with it decisively. So that's the first thing. But then a close second is really what I would put under the broad umbrella of an absence of opportunity. Economic opportunity in particular is how I'd frame it. Okay. But the territory used to be a place where you could get ahead, and now people are so frustrated that they're trying to figure out how to get out. People openly will tell me, we'd leave, but we can't because our house is worth nothing now because the economy is toilet. And that doesn't have to be the way it is. So I'm trying to stop that hemorrhage. But you will see the two big issues are to do with crime and social dysfunction, and then absence of opportunity, which is now manifesting in cost of living concerns, right? People are really concerned about how to live and pay for stuff. and survive here. They have less disposable income than they had before. Certain things are within the control of a state or territory government. Certain things are in the control of a federal government.
Yep.
But I can assure you as well that the federal government will take a bunch of grown-ups running this place a lot more seriously. And I know that sounds a little bit harsh. Honestly speaking, I know there are some very decent, reasonable people that are in Parliament, and I'm sure they've done their best, but I think they've been given a fair shot.
Yep.
They've had 20 of the last 24 years to try and get the place to a better place,
Yep.
and in my opinion, it's tracking backwards on a ton of metrics.
Yep.
So, I hear the same issues. It is about social dysfunction and crime. It is about economic opportunity. There are lots of concerns about population now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think I probably skew that data set given my, the conversations we have. But if I'm talking to businesses, every single one has a workforce problem, right? If I'm talking to people about education or healthcare, it's the same thing, where they're like, I went to the hospital and there's just not enough staff there to do the jobs that needs to be done. They seem to be working super hard and are frazzled. My school doesn't have teachers in the way that it used to, and they're cycling in and out, and
Yep.
So I think they're really the issues are obvious to everyone in some ways. The question is how to address the issues
Yep.
and how to approach solutions. And I wouldn't invest all my time and effort straight away trying to attract more financial capital to the Northern Territory. What we should be focusing on is how to bolster human capital, which means getting some of it from outside, and then also trying to figure out how to keep people here and develop them. I mean, I should mention, like when I came back in to do the job I was doing initially, I was given carriage of a cross-governmental population policy working group, which had representatives from a half a dozen government departments. And had I stayed in the public service, I would have written a report, a blueprint for how to create sustainable population growth. But unfortunately, my job got wound up.
Yep.
So, my options were to teach the saxophone, move back to England, or get in an orange shirt.
So now that you're in it, is it everything you thought it would be? Is it worse? Is it, are there sides to it that, people just don't see? They think, it's all glitz and glamour. You're at the market, you're shaking hands, all that sort of stuff, kissing babies.
Yeah.
But, is there a darker side to it, that people just might not understand?
Yeah, I think, look, nothing is as it seems from the outside for anyone, right? So what I can say is that somebody said something to me the other day about it being like, I always knew you were destined for glamorous things. And I was thinking to myself, I'm standing in traffic at 7:30 in the morning, swinging a sign around. This is what I did a PhD for, right? I spent like the best part of 8 hours a day either waving signs in traffic or knocking on people's doors. That is the reality of politics in a place like the Northern Territory, where you have to meet everyone and convince them to vote for you. And one of the things I didn't mention before when you're asking about feedback is that people are seriously they're what we call double haters in the US, but it's happening here as well. People don't want to vote for Labor, but they also don't particularly want to vote for a major party.
Yep.
So you have to give people a reason to choose change, right? And so, is it everything I thought it would be? Well, I have been involved in other elections and processes like this before.
Yep.
And so I knew about the gritty side of it, the ugly side of it. It's tough. It's it's ugly. Politics is politics.
Yep.
I am committed to fighting a good, clean fight and not punching below the belt.
Yep.
But at the same time, I'm here to win. So you fight a good, clean fight, but you fight competitively and you fight to win. And I hope that it's a reasonably clean campaign where there is as little mud slung as possible. But the brutal reality of it is, yes, it's politics is rough and tumble and it's tough. And personally speaking, I think this is the stupidest possible way to pick people to try and make decisions about who should be in charge of the justice system, the healthcare system, or the economy. But this is our system. And so what you do is you go out there and you put in the hard work to demonstrate to the people that you care enough that you are willing to take, all the stuff that is not that fun, because honestly, of course, there's a lot of people who are very disenchanted, very disenfranchised, frankly speaking, pissed off, and they want to let you know they're pissed off. And so you do your best to listen to that and then offer them in response, well, this is why I'm doing it and this is what I can offer, and I hope that you will consider, that there is an alternative, And I have a clear sense personally of my moral, ideological and philosophical standpoints. I know what I stand for. I know why I'm doing this. I'm not doing this to hang around in Parliament for 4 years and put it on my CV and be like, I was a parliamentarian for a bit.
Yep.
You know, that's not, for me, this is about problem solving. And so to get to a vantage where I have sufficient support to be able to help problem solve for the benefit of Territorians, you got to wave a sign in traffic for a few hours a day.
Yep.
You know,
So if we get to the end of a 4-year CLP term, you know, how are you measuring success in your mind? How should a government be judged?
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, a few people have been asking me this recently. I think the first thing you'll find is that there will be a drop-off in crime. There will be stabilisation on some economic measures. But you have to appreciate that coming back from being $12 billion in the hole...
We're a long way back, aren't we?
That's right. It's going to take some time.
Yep.
So I'm not in this with a view to being there for 4 years. I'm in this with a view to being there for the next decade plus. That's what I've come to do. I've given up my life in England. I live in Stuart Park. I've got all my saxophones here with me now. The plan is to be here for the long haul. And we've got a team of people coming in, I think, with that opinion as well, that we're here for the long haul. We're here to turn the Territory's fortunes around. And so first of all, you will be able to measure that in stability. And then you'll be able to measure it in growth. And then you'll be able to measure it in prosperity.
Yep.
Right? So it takes time though. So I don't want to sell fanciful, you know, figures. Like, as I say, and some of the things are just simply out of your control. They're to do with larger world forces, macroeconomic forces, but we still need to do our bit to look after our own patch, right? And so that's I think, the focus.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people feel like they were burned probably by the last elected CLP government.
Right, so.
You know, I think they were quite fiscally responsible. You know, they under duress almost, you know, they were handed a significant debt from the previous Labor government. They balanced the books, so to speak.
Yep.
But I guess the major negative to that government was instability. So I think people are really looking for that in a CLP government this time.
Yeah, and I think they should expect that, and they can be confident that they will get that.
Yeah.
And the reason I think that's the case is because, as I say, we are united behind somebody who listens.
Yep.
And that is the important part. Like, there is a team here. You'll see a lot of us talking about being a team with a plan, because that's exactly what we are. We are a team of people with a series of plans for how to rebuild the Northern Territory. So I think that's a fair thing to say. The honest truth is that the CLP government between 2012 and 2016 was obviously not the CLP's finest hour, okay? And the other thing to remember with that, though, is that just none of those people are around anymore. They're all gone. The last remaining survivor of all of that is Leah Finocchiaro. And fortunately, we're lucky that she's the one that survived the process, because she's a good person for us to get behind. And I think that we will have a strong and stable government made up of people with real-world expertise and professional expertise who are able to make a really positive contribution.
Yep.
But yeah, I hear it all the time. Like, when you're out on the doorsteps, people will often be like, well, it was a disaster last time. And I'll be like, sure was. And good news is none of those people are really involved in the process anymore.
Yep.
You know, in front of the scenes or behind the scenes. And so I have confidence that it is reverting to being the Territory Party. And I also think it's great that the CLP has, you know, broadened its candidate base to reflect the Territory. You've got some very diverse people running for Parliament, right? But the thing is, they haven't been picked as diversity hires. They're not like equal opportunity candidates. They are people that are being picked on merit. You've got excellent people who happen to be from a diverse range of economic, social, religious, racial, whatever backgrounds.
Yep.
But, you know, if you don't do that, then you just keep drawing from the same small, shallow pool.
Yep.
And I think that's part of the problem. It's not for me to comment on what the Labor Party's processes are, but it's clear that there's a lot of people from a very small pool that are representing the Labor Party.
Seems like it's quite insular.
Yeah, I think it is.
You know, union reps, teachers, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's
better or
absolutely
worse. Yeah.
Look, that's what it is, and that's their process. And if people want more of the same, they should vote for more of the same. And if they want people to graduate through, you know, union leadership into parliamentary leadership, then that's what they should vote for. Or, you know, I'm certainly not anti-teacher, but I'm not convinced that the current crop of teachers that are in Parliament House could run a school collectively together. So, you know, I just think at the end of the day, on our side, we have people with healthcare experience, educational experience, economic experience, legal experience, small business experience. I could go on and on, right? And That's what you need. That's what you need. And you need somebody who listens as a leader, and we've got that. And you need, the support from the grassroots, and we've got that. So I'm asking people to take the CLP, the new CLP, seriously and at their word.
Can you win?
Oh, electoral math is a tough one, isn't it?
Well, the bookies have you at $1.55, I think, at the moment.
And do you know what, mate?
$2.50.
That is a. I got a lot of mates around the world in various like pointy end finance and quantitative kind of jobs. And when push comes to shove, for all of their sophisticated algorithms, they honestly look at Sportsbet and Tab and
Voting
like the
with your
bookie
money.
sites. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And you are right. 6 months ago,
It was the other way around.
It was the other way around.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
And so, but that's to supply the next chief minister. Okay,
Right.
those bets, when you look at them, it's like, who will supply the next chief minister?
Yep.
I hope, for the benefit of the Northern Territory, that there is a clear and decisive CLP victory where we have majority government, and we're not held hostage by random independents. Right? I think it's important that there's a diversity of people running for Parliament, whether they're independents, Greens, Monster Raving Looney Party, whatever. It doesn't matter.
Yep.
But what I'm championing is a majority CLP government led by Leo Finocchiaro, of which I would like to be a team member, right? And I think that is possible to be achieved. I think the existing 7 parliamentarians that the CLP have are all excellent, and I expect that they will be returned to Parliament with enhanced majorities. And then the question becomes, how will the CLP win 6 or more extra seats? I think there are 6 or more extra seats that are winnable, and I believe mine could be one of them.
Yep.
Yeah.
So come August, win, lose or draw, what's next on the agenda for Dr. Tanzil Rahman? Is it, you got the DNA forum, I think you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Is there any other things you've got on the boil at the moment?
Yeah, look, I mean, the day after the election, I have to get on a flight to WA to go and speak at that conference. So at some point, I'm going to have to get organised for that. That will be the immediate aftermath, I guess. But then it's about, for me, I guess, specifically creating the stability and structures here to be here for the long run.
Yep.
And so I grew up in Karama, which is where my dad is still living. Since moving back here, I've moved to Stuart Park. I've got a lovely house now and a garden I can't control. So I probably should do something about getting that under control. And I'm actually really looking forward to not just all this big picture stuff, but investing in the local stuff.
Yep.
Stuart Park is a place in particular that has really fallen through the cracks politically for a while. It's gone between electorates and been neglected a bit, I think. And so I'd really like to champion local regeneration and development in that area.
Right.
Because it's pretty clear now that it is, run down and has been neglected.
Yeah. Well, sorry, can I just
go
say
ahead,
quickly?
please, yeah.
Because I'm a constituent of Stuart Park.
Are you a constituent of Stuart
I live
Park?
there, yes.
Oh,
I've
geez,
been
I
there for
didn't
a few
realise.
years. So it is an interesting place. There's a bit of a mixed bag there. You've got old money, you've got new money, and sort of everything in between.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that it is...
Well, I didn't realise I was pitching for your vote specifically, but I mean, no, but in all seriousness, the place is very, 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 very polarised. It's not like a place that's been uniformly gentrified.
Yeah.
There are some lovely $1 million houses, and then there are some lovely renovated flats, and then there's a lot of places in need of renewal, and all of that requires some local championing, and none of that has happened.
Yep.
And I believe in the importance of being a good local member, which means living in the electorate and actually being engaged with and in contact with the people. And it's a big patch that I cover, but Stuart Park is one of the areas where I see, actually another one, for example, like a place like Berrima Northcrest is really important to succeed. You want these new build suburbs to succeed. And so, my remit would be wide, but I would want to make sure that Berrima Northcrest, the Narrows, Stuart Park, these places which have been, I think, neglected to a certain extent, get some renewed focus. So I would fully expect that if I'm lucky enough to get elected, that my first port of call will be to, duck off, give a speech and then come back, but then also focus on my local patch. And then, we take the rest one step at a time from there.
Well, I don't have any more questions, but we like to give an opportunity for our guests to just, have a final message or, just say something that people don't know about them or anything like that. Do you have a sort of a final send-off for the people?
I wish I had thought about something cool and inspiring.
Or a message to the voters, why the CLP is probably the right choice this time around.
Look, I think I probably made the point repeatedly, and so I don't want to
labour it.
Yeah, budum ching. Yeah. Look, I think at the simplest possible level, we need change.
Yep.
And you can believe in what the CLP is offering. So I would encourage people to not vote for us blindly, not vote for us in protest, but vote for us actively because we are the better choice. And at this juncture, you know, your vote is so important, right? If you are, you know, just too fed up and frustrated to get to the polls, then there will be no change of government. If you don't make an active choice and look at the candidates and compare them, there will be no change of government. If you don't take your responsibility seriously, you know, as somebody who is franchised to vote, then there will be no change of government. And what the Northern Territory needs desperately right now is a change of government.
Dr. Tanzil Rahman, thanks for your time, mate, and best of luck with the general election in August.
Thanks very much, mate. It's been a pleasure.
Appreciate it.
No worries.
Thanks, everyone.